What if history isn't fixed, but fluid, flickering like a candle seen through fog? Somewhere between fact and fiction, memory and myth, lies a quiet riddle that millions have unknowingly carried inside them. Imagine remembering a funeral that never happened, a line from a beloved film that no one ever spoke, a childhood book with a title that, officially, never existed. These aren't simple mistakes or misquotes. They are vivid, specific, emotionally anchored recollections that entire populations share. And yet, according to every record, they're wrong. Welcome to the world of mass memory shifts, colloquially known as the Mandela Effect. Named after a peculiar moment in 2009 when Fiona Broome, a paranormal researcher, casually mentioned her memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s. She wasn't alone. To her astonishment, others at the conference echoed her memory. The funeral broadcast on TV, the chaos in the streets, the weeping widow addressing the world. But Mandela was alive, released in 1990, and later elected president of South Africa. This shared false memory wasn't vague or blurry. It was detailed and deeply felt, a complete narrative etched into the minds of strangers from different places. When Broome launched a website documenting similar phenomena, the floodgates opened. Thousands of people reached out with uncanny stories of things they remembered vividly, but which the official record said never happened. They remembered not only what they saw or heard, but how they felt. The collective sense of certainty was unnerving. Psychologists began to take note. Dr. Neil Dagnall, among others, found that these weren't isolated confusions. People reporting Mandela Effect memories described them with confidence, consistency, and emotional depth. These weren't random errors. They followed structure, events, consequences, visuals. A tapestry of memories that mirrored one another, except they didn't align with historical fact. Neurologically, the mystery deepened. Brain scans showed that false memories often activate the same regions as real ones. To the person remembering, there's no perceptible difference. A made-up memory can feel as real, sometimes more real, than something that actually occurred. The Mandela case set a precedent, inviting a broader investigation into the strange ways memory might deceive not just individuals, but societies. It turned out Mandela wasn't alone. There were entire catalogs of events, objects, phrases, and images that people remembered, but never existed in the form they recalled. If memory, the very foundation of our identity and knowledge, can be this unreliable, what does it mean for history, for truth, for shared reality? This series invites you into that question. Across 14 chapters, we'll walk through the uncanny hall of mirrors that is collective false memory. Each part will explore a different case, some funny, others unsettling, all profoundly human. We'll trace the contours of forgotten truths, ask why certain errors are so stubborn, and reflect on what it means when millions remember something that never happened. This is not a story of conspiracy or glitching universes. It's a story of us, of how the human mind in all its complexity sometimes chooses meaning over fact, emotion over evidence, story over reality. And yet, that doesn't make it any less real. The journey begins with a whisper from the past, a flicker in the mind that says, "I know what I saw." It's time to listen, to question not only the world around us, but the world within. Because if memory can lie, then truth is no longer just what happened. It's also what we believe did. It began with a mirror, or rather, the memory of one. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Nearly everyone knows the line, spoken in countless accents by children playing dress-up, echoed in cartoons, echoed again in satire and song. It's one of those cultural phrases that feels universal, etched into childhood, sewn into pop culture's very fabric. Except it was never said, not in the way we remember. In the original Disney version of Snow White, and The Seven Dwarfs from 1937, the evil queen says something different. Magic mirror on the wall. No mirror, mirror, no repetition, just magic mirror. When this discrepancy resurfaced in 2012 through online forums and nostalgia threads, the reaction was swift and disorienting. Millions swore they had heard "Mirror, Mirror" in the film. They remembered it clearly. The queen standing before the enchanted glass, the words dripping with menace. Many had repeated the phrase during childhood, mimicked it with costumes, or seen it quoted on merchandise. But when they revisited the movie, the line was gone, replaced by something they were certain had never been there before. Confusion turned to disbelief. Disbelief turned to something deeper, the unsettling realization that their memory had lied. Dr. Henry Roiger III, a cognitive scientist studying false memory formation, found this case especially compelling. Over 85% of people familiar with Snow White initially recall the incorrect phrase. That's not a minor slip. That's a phenomenon. One possible explanation? Linguistic rhythm. Mirror, mirror has a hypnotic cadence, easier to remember, easier to recite. It echoes the poetic structure of fairy tales. But that alone doesn't explain why people recall hearing it, hearing the actual voice of the animated queen saying words that were never recorded. Stranger still, the original Brothers Grimm tale did use mirror, mirror. So perhaps over time, the public subconsciously blended the book with the film. But this doesn't match the specifics of people's memories. They don't remember reading it. They remember watching it, seeing, hearing, believing. The error is so widespread that even official Disney merchandise has mistakenly quoted it. Theme parks, lunchboxes, T-shirts. The false memory became the dominant cultural version. A mistake so beloved, it became canon. Brain imaging has shown that people recalling the incorrect phrase show activation in auditory regions associated with actual hearing. In other words, their brains react as though they genuinely heard mirror, mirror. It's not just an intellectual mix-up, it's a sensory one. And so we're left with a simple yet profound question. If our minds can fabricate entire moments complete with sound, context, and emotion, what else have we imagined? In this case, it's just a fairy tale line. But fairy tales are where we first learn what to trust and what to fear. They're our childhood's instruction manual for making sense of the world. If even those stories can shift beneath our feet, what about the rest? What we see, what we hear, what we remember, all feel solid until they're not. Perhaps memory isn't a mirror after all. Perhaps it's a spell, cast not by magic but by the fragile alchemy of the mind. And every now and then, that spell breaks. The question is, do we notice when it does? A bookshelf, a bedtime story, a bear family living in a treehouse, seemingly innocent memories shared by generations. The Berenstain Bears. Or was it Berenstain? For millions who grew up in the 1980s and 1990s, the answer seems obvious. It was spelled with an E, Berenstain. That's how it sounded, how it looked on the covers of dozens of books stacked in bedrooms and school libraries. Parents read it aloud. Children corrected each other's pronunciations. Even now, adults insist it had to be Berenstain, I remember it. But it wasn't. According to every archived book, every official record, the series has always been called The Berenstain Bears with an A. Not a single documented version has used the E spelling. And yet the collective certainty remains, a memory so persistent and emotionally anchored that entire families have debated it at dinner tables. This isn't simple misremembering, it's generational. Dr. Cynthia Lieberman from Northwestern University conducted large-scale surveys involving thousands of participants. Nearly 70% recalled the Stein spelling when asked to write the name from memory. When presented with the actual Stein version, many were stunned. They weren't just surprised, They were unsettled, even angry. Some swore they had books on their shelves that once said Berenstain, only to find Stain in their childhood copies. Others reported VHS tapes, library cards, or catalogs showing the E version, though when examined, those too said Stain. So what causes this shared rewriting of childhood memory? Phonetics may play a role. Berenstain matches common Jewish surnames: Einstein, Goldstein, Frankenstein. Stain feels awkward, unfamiliar. Our minds may have reshaped the unfamiliar into the expected. It's a form of cognitive autocorrect, turning oddities into patterns we recognize. But that doesn't explain the emotional certainty. There's something sacred about childhood memories. They live in a soft light, untouched by time, fused with a sense of safety and wonder. To find out that one of them is wrong, that something as innocent as a bare family's name never existed the way we recall, feels like a small betrayal. It calls into question not just what we remember, but how we remember. Is memory a fixed archive? Or is it rewritten each time we revisit it, like clay shaped anew by touch? Internet forums have become confessional booths for the bewildered. Thousands of people have poured out stories about realizing the change. Some compare it to waking from a dream. Others wonder aloud, did the past shift? Did we somehow cross timelines? While those are just metaphors, they speak to something deeper, our need for coherence. For memory to mean something, it must be stable. When that stability wavers, so does our trust in the foundation of who we are. The Berenstain Bears aren't just cartoon animals. They're emissaries from a simpler time. And if even they are misremembered, what else from our past might be built on sand? It's not just about spelling, it's about belief. It's about the quiet realization that sometimes the past isn't where we left it. A stadium roars, flags wave, lights flare against the night sky. And then Freddie Mercury steps to the mic and belts the final note. We are the champions of the world. Or did he? Millions remember it that way. The triumphant ending, the emotional punctuation that sends chills down the spine. It's been mimicked by comedians, shouted in locker rooms, echoed in movie finales. It feels like the ending. It must be the ending. Except it isn't. In the original studio recording of Queen's iconic anthem, Mercury ends on a hanging note. We are the champions. Full stop. No final flourish. No of the world. Just silence. When people rediscovered this in the mid-2010s, the reaction was near universal disbelief. Listeners played the song again and again, convinced something was missing. And not just a word, they were missing an entire feeling. Dr. Julia Shaw, a researcher in memory and emotion, found this case to be particularly revealing. Her surveys showed that nearly 80% of people familiar with the song remembered the "of the world" ending as fact. Not only did they recall hearing it, they described emotional reactions tied to it. Goosebumps, tears, catharsis. Where did it come from? Some speculate it's due to the lyrics' earlier appearance in the song, "No time for losers, 'cause we are the champions of the world." It's there, yes, but not at the end. Still, people don't just remember it occurring, they remember it closing the song, delivering that final, rousing note. Others suggest that live performances, where Mercury sometimes added the phrase for dramatic effect, may have reshaped our memory of the original. Over time, perhaps the emotional satisfaction of hearing it live merged with the studio version in our minds. But there's more at play here than just lyrical placement. Music is memory's playground. The brain often edits songs to meet emotional expectations, completing them in ways that feel whole. If a song doesn't resolve the way we want, our minds sometimes fill in the gap. And when millions do this together, a new version is born, not recorded in vinyl or digital files, but etched into cultural consciousness. This version becomes dominant, even if it's incorrect. Psychologically, this phenomenon offers a window into how we construct emotional reality. The ending we remember may never have existed, but it felt right. That alone gave it power. For many, hearing the actual studio version today feels jarring, incomplete, like a story missing its final line. The silence after "We Are the Champions" doesn't satisfy. It unsettles. And maybe that's the key. We don't just remember what we hear. We remember what we feel when we hear it. That's what our brains latch onto. The of-the-world memory isn't just a misheard lyric. It's an emotional truth, carefully built and lovingly preserved. So what do we trust more, the record or the resonance? Is a memory false if it moved us more than the truth? Or is there something deeper in the collective desire for endings that uplift, songs that resolve, stories that conclude with a roar rather than a whisper? Maybe the final lyric we remember was never on the tape, but perhaps it always lived in the silence that followed. It's one of the most scrutinized pieces of film in American history, grainy, silent, and frozen in time. The Zapruder film. Dallas, 1963. President John F. Kennedy's motorcade gliding through Dealey Plaza. And then, the unthinkable. Millions who've seen that footage remember the same thing. A four-seater convertible with the President and First Lady in the back, two Secret Service agents up front. A compact, tragic scene. Simple, seared into memory. But the historical record says otherwise. The actual car had 6 people: President Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, his wife Nellie, a driver, and a Secret Service agent. 6 seats, 3 rows. This isn't a matter of speculation. It's documented in photographs, eyewitness testimony, official records. And yet, a substantial portion of Americans, especially those who lived through the era, remember it differently. 4 people, always 4. The discovery of this memory discrepancy became widely discussed in the early 2010s. Online forums buzzed with confusion. People watched the Zapruder film again and swore it looked altered, distorted from what they remembered seeing in school documentaries, on late-night television, or even during the original news broadcasts. Some said they remembered the president alone in the back, a clearer shot. Others had mental images of a more intimate vehicle, uncluttered by extra passengers. Why is this collective memory so persistent? Dr. James Lampin, a researcher in memory and historical trauma, suggests that the emotional weight of the assassination simplified the scene in our minds. In moments of tragedy, the brain focuses tightly on the central figures, cropping out the periphery, reducing complexity to clarity. What we remember is the emotional core: Kennedy, exposed, vulnerable, falling. The others, however real, fade into the background. Trauma, it turns out, has a way of reshaping memory, not just in individuals, but across entire cultures. Events of profound emotional intensity are often remembered not as they happened, but as they felt. And in that felt history, the car was smaller, the scene tighter, the tragedy sharper. Media depictions may have reinforced the false memory. Early reenactments, educational animations, and dramatized versions of the assassination often used simplified visuals. Artistic license favored a 4-seater, both for visual focus and narrative economy. Over time, those representations began to overwrite the actual footage in the public mind. But even when shown the real footage, many people remain unconvinced. They trust their memory more than their eyes. It's a revealing contradiction. If memory can overwrite historical fact in something as monumental as a presidential assassination, what else might it have quietly revised? The 6-person limousine isn't just a detail, it's a mirror reflecting the gap between remembered history and recorded history. And it forces us to ask, when the heart witnesses something, does the mind edit the frame? Perhaps the story we carry isn't the one that happened, it's the one we needed to remember. Look at a map. Really look. Where is South America? Most would say, confidently, that it lies directly below North America, like a vertical continuation of the Western Hemisphere. For many, that image feels unshakable. It's the map we saw in classrooms, on globes, in textbooks. Two continents stacked like building blocks, but it's not correct. South America, in reality, is offset far to the east. Its northern edge lies east of Florida, and much of the continent stretches well into the Atlantic. It's not a southern extension, it's a diagonal drift leaning eastward. This geographical revelation has startled people across generations. When researchers in 2014 began studying how students placed continents on blank maps, they noticed something odd. The majority placed South America too far west. Adults did the same. The error wasn't random, it was systematic. Dr. Sarah Creamer-Rager, a spatial memory specialist, investigated further and discovered that nearly 60% of global participants, including those from countries on different continents, misremembered South America's position in the same way. It wasn't a local education problem. It was global. How could such a fundamental piece of knowledge be so consistently wrong? Theories abound. One common explanation points to map projections. Most of us grew up looking at Mercator maps, rectangular representations that stretch and distort the globe to fit a grid. In the process, landmasses shift subtly. South America gets nudged westward, losing its true orientation. But the depth of this false memory goes beyond projection distortion. People don't just misplace the continent, they're surprised, even shaken, when shown the correct version. Some feel certain that maps must have changed, that geography itself has shifted. The reaction isn't confusion, it's disbelief. That emotional intensity hints at something deeper. Mental maps are more than coordinates. They're part of how we understand the world, how we imagine distances, travel, connection. They're stitched into memory through repetition, early education, and our intuitive sense of space. When that framework is disrupted, it doesn't just alter geography. It destabilizes our sense of orientation. It's not just where South America is that matters. It's where we believed it had always been. Interestingly, flight patterns have exposed this memory gap. Some travelers express confusion about why flights from North America to South America veer eastward. Their internal compass expected a straight shot south. Instead, reality bends in a way their mental map never accounted for. Recent neurological research has shown that spatial memory engages the same brain regions used for navigation and emotional anchoring. False spatial memories activate these systems just as real ones do. To the mind, the incorrect position feels true, as solid as the ground itself. And perhaps that's the unsettling part. If even the continents can shift in our memory, what else might move beneath our feet? We often trust maps as symbols of certainty. They chart oceans, mark borders, define nations. But behind every map is a story of how we chose to see the world. Maybe the real map isn't printed on paper or displayed on screens. Maybe it's drawn in the quiet recesses of the mind, where belief and memory become cartographers of a world that never was. A single figure stands in defiance, a lone man blocking a column of tanks in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. It is one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. A moment of fragile courage, frozen in time. The man steps forward, bags in hand, unwavering as the metal beasts lurch to a stop. Millions around the world remember what happened next. They remember him dying. The tanks, they say, ran him over. The camera cut away. The crowd screamed. Some even recall the news anchor's hushed tone, the world's outrage, the sense of unbearable tragedy. It was, many claim, the image that defined their understanding of tyranny. But here's the truth. The man was not killed, not on camera, not in any footage. In the surviving recordings, the tanks halt. The man climbs onto the lead vehicle, speaks briefly, and then climbs down. After a tense standoff, he is pulled away by bystanders. His identity remains unknown. His fate after the moment is uncertain. but in the videos he survives. So where did the memory of his death come from? When anniversary coverage of the protests resurfaced in 2014, thousands were shocked to rediscover the real footage. They were certain, absolutely certain, that they had seen him crushed under the treads. Not just imagined it, but watched it, felt it. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, a leading expert on memory distortion, has studied the phenomenon. She found that over a third of people familiar with the image initially believed the man had died. Their accounts were detailed, vivid. They described blood, silence, the weight of mourning. It wasn't a vague impression, it was a memory. Psychologists suggest the false recollection may stem from the emotional gravity of the protests. Hundreds were killed elsewhere in Beijing that day. Images of bodies, chaos, and gunfire saturated the media. The expectation of brutality was so strong that in many minds it rewrote the fate of one man in a white shirt. The emotional script demanded tragedy, and so the mind supplied it. Some say the misremembering was fueled by dramatizations or incomplete news coverage. Others point to a kind of narrative inevitability. In the mental version of that story, the man must die. It fits the pattern of sacrifice, of martyrdom. A perfect ending, however false. What makes this case so haunting is that people don't just recall seeing his death, they mourned it. Some say it shaped their worldview, ignited their political consciousness, changed how they understood power. That emotional imprint is not easily undone. In recent brain imaging studies, people recalling the false version of the event showed activation in trauma-related regions, suggesting their minds responded as if the event truly occurred. The memory was constructed not from fact, but from feeling. And feeling, it turns out, may be the architect of most of what we call memory. The story of Tank Man is still powerful, still real. But for many, it lives in two versions, the documented and the remembered, which raises a difficult question. When emotion rewrites fact and memory becomes myth, where does truth go? Maybe history isn't always written by victors or carved in stone. Maybe it's remembered, mistakenly, passionately, by those who watched with trembling hearts and believed they saw the end. He wears a top hat, a bow tie, and a grin. He's the Monopoly man, rich Uncle Pennybags. The face of capitalism in miniature, cheerfully guiding players through bankruptcies and boardwalks. For generations, he's been a fixture in family rooms, his face etched into the memories of childhood game nights. And everyone remembers the monocle, a sleek little lens perched over one eye, swinging from a chain, completing his wealthy caricature. It's appeared in Halloween costumes, parodies, cartoons, even advertisements mimicking the iconic image. Ask almost anyone to describe him, and they'll mention it. But he's never worn one, not in any official version, not in the original design from 1936, nor in the countless revisions since. Rich Uncle Pennybags has always been monocle-free. This revelation stuns people. They aren't just surprised, they're shaken. I know he had one, they say. Some even claim they used to trace it on the game board. Others swear they remember animated commercials showing him tipping his hat and adjusting his monocle. How can so many people be wrong? Dr. Kimberly Wade, who studies memory reconstruction, explored this mystery and found a startling truth. Over 80% of people familiar with the game remember the monocle. When asked to draw him from memory, most include it. The image feels essential, but it's a fabrication. So where does it come from? One theory points to character conflation. Mr. Peanut, the Planters mascot, does wear a monocle, along with a top hat and cane. The visual similarities may have bled together in memory. Both figures embody the same archetype, the old-fashioned, wealthy gentleman. In the hazy corridors of childhood memory, they may have merged, but that doesn't explain the conviction. People don't just vaguely think he had a monocle, they see it in their minds. They remember plastic figurines, commercial jingles, birthday party cakes. These aren't guesses, they're scenes. And that's the unsettling part. Visual memory is fallible. The mind stores fragments and feelings, not photographs. When recalling images, it fills in the blanks. If a monocle should be there, the brain may simply insert it. Over time, the imagined detail becomes indistinguishable from truth. The Monopoly Man example shows how false memory isn't always about dramatic events. Sometimes it's trivial, playful even. But that's what makes it so profound. If we can misremember something as mundane as a board game mascot, what does that say about our recollections of bigger things? What else have we embellished or erased? Culturally, the false memory has become so dominant that it now appears in media with more frequency than the actual design. In effect, the error has replaced the original. The fake has become canon. So the next time you open the game box, stare closely at his face. You won't find what you expect. No monocle, just a smile, and the quiet realization that your memory, so vivid and sure, might be a little less reliable than you thought. And perhaps that's the real game being played. Not on the board, but in our minds. There's fruit, bright, colorful, fresh. And then there's the cornucopia. If you wore Fruit of the Loom underwear growing up, chances are you can picture the logo clearly. A woven horn of plenty, brimming with apples, grapes, leaves, and bounty. A classic image. A symbol of abundance. You remember it from clothing tags, packaging, department store racks. It was always there. Except it wasn't. Fruit of the Loom has never used a cornucopia in its logo. Not once in its 170-year history. Not in vintage ads, trademark filings, or archive designs. The logo has always been just fruit. The reaction to this fact is almost always the same. Disbelief. Then defiance. That's not possible, people say. I remember it. I learned what a cornucopia was because of that logo. Dr. Carol Laney, a memory researcher at Reed College, studied this case and found it to be one of the most vivid examples of brand-related false memory. People didn't just assume the cornucopia was there. They remembered the color of the wicker, the way it curved behind the fruit, the texture of the horn. Their recollections were specific, textured, sensory. What's more, these memories often carried meaning. Some say it was the first time they encountered the idea of harvest or Thanksgiving symbolism. The logo wasn't just a design, it was a lesson. So how did an image that never existed become so deeply embedded in collective memory? The answer may lie in the nature of symbols. A pile of fruit naturally evokes the idea of a cornucopia. Our brains, seeking order and narrative, complete the image. And once completed, that imagined detail becomes as real as the original. Over time, reinforced by repetition and emotion, it solidifies. But there's also something more cultural at work. Cornucopias are part of the American symbolic landscape. They appear in school crafts, holiday decor, and autumn displays. When paired with fruit, the mind defaults to the horn. It should be there. So it is, at least in memory. This false memory has become so powerful that it now appears in parody logos, knockoff brands, and even artwork that tries to correct the official image. In some ways, the imagined version is more iconic than the truth. When consumers are shown the real logo, their response is often visceral. That's not my Fruit of the Loom, they say. Some even believe the company must have quietly changed the design, erasing the cornucopia without warning. But historical archives show no such change. The cornucopia never existed. Still, the memory lingers. Not because of marketing trickery or a conspiracy, but because of how the human mind weaves meaning into imagery. Our memories aren't records, they're interpretations, and sometimes the interpretations are more compelling than the facts. The Fruit of the Loom logo stands as a quiet reminder that even the most mundane things, a tag on a t-shirt, a label in a drawer, can reveal the mysteries of perception. It's not just about what we see. It's about what we expect to see and what that says about us. A dark cell, a cold stone floor, and the end of an era. For many, Nelson Mandela died in the 1980s. They remember the news reports, his funeral, the riots, the mourning. They recall classroom lessons, teary-eyed television coverage, speeches by his widow. They remember feeling it, feeling the world lose a giant. But none of it happened. Mandela was released from prison in 1990. He went on to lead South Africa out of apartheid, became president in 1994, and lived until 2013. Yet the memory of his earlier death persists, not just in vague impressions, but in detailed, emotionally charged recollections shared by thousands, maybe millions. It's the memory that gave the Mandela Effect its name. When researcher Fiona Broom mentioned her memory of Mandela's death at a conference in 2009, she was stunned to find others who remembered the same thing, not just remembering his death, but the same version of it, the same imagery, the same grief. She created a website to collect stories. The flood began. People described the broadcast scenes, the flowers, the global response. They remembered talking about it at school. Some even recalled where they were when they heard the news. What emerged was something eerie, a shared false memory with narrative structure, emotional weight, and near-universal consistency. Not a haze of uncertainty, but a clear memory of something that never occurred. Dr. Neil Dagnall and other psychologists began studying the phenomenon. They found that people who reported the Mandela memory didn't just believe it, they felt it. Their confidence levels were high, their descriptions aligned. Their emotional reactions were genuine. Neurologically, it made sense. Brain imaging studies show that false memories light up the same regions as true ones. They carry the same weight, the same conviction. But how could such a detailed and shared memory form? One theory points to media exposure. Mandela was a frequent symbol of resistance, often depicted as dying or sacrificed in fiction, protest art, and speculative conversation. Over time, fragments of possibility may have been sewn into a false past. Others believe the memory represents an emotional placeholder, grief for injustice, projected onto a figure who symbolized hope. In that narrative, Mandela's early death makes sense emotionally, even if it didn't happen. And once a memory is accepted, the mind begins to fill in the details. A collective editing process begins. Soon, the false memory isn't a glitch. It's a story. Complete, believable, and emotionally true. The Mandela memory remains the cornerstone of this entire phenomenon. It's the prototype, the spark that revealed something deeper. That memory isn't just personal, it can be collective, cultural, viral, and in its most powerful form, memory doesn't just reflect what happened. It reflects what we expected to happen, what we feared, what we believed made the most narrative sense. It forces us to ask a chilling question. If we can grieve something that never happened, what else have we eulogized in error? Perhaps the mind, in its quest for meaning, sometimes writes endings that reality never delivered, and perhaps that's how myths are born, in the silence between what was and what should have been. A shadowed corridor, a glass wall, a man behind bars with eyes that pierce through silence. Hello, Clarice. It's one of the most quoted lines in modern cinema, chilling, iconic. Spoken with eerie calm by Hannibal Lecter as he greets FBI agent Clarice Starling in The Silence of the Lambs. The line has echoed through decades of pop culture, parodied in sketches, whispered at Halloween parties, etched into the minds of millions. But it was never said, not in that scene, not in the entire film. When Clarice meets Lecter for the first time, he says something different. "Good evening, Clarice." That's the actual line. No hello, no dramatic pause, just a formal, quiet greeting. and yet the false memory prevails. Dr. Lynn Nuttall, a specialist in memory and emotion, has studied this case and found it to be one of the most enduring examples of cinematic misremembering. Over 70% of people familiar with the film recall the incorrect quote. They don't just believe they heard it, they can mimic it. The tone, the pause, the intonation. They're certain. Some recall hearing it in trailers, others in the film itself. A few even remember rewinding VHS tapes to watch the scene again. But the footage tells another story. So where did Hello, Clarice come from? The answer may lie in parody. Pop culture, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, latched onto the phrase. It appeared in comedy sketches, animated shows, and impersonations. Each time, the quote was reinforced. It became shorthand for Lecter, just as Luke, I am your father did for Darth Vader, another famously misquoted line. Eventually, the parody replaced the original, but there's something deeper happening here. The mind, especially when dealing with iconic moments, tends to simplify. It reshapes dialogue to match expectations. Hello, Clarice is direct, haunting, instantly memorable. It fits the mood. It sounds right. And so it becomes real. What's remarkable is how specific the memory is. People don't just recall the phrase. They recall Anthony Hopkins' delivery, the acoustics of the prison hall, even the flicker of fluorescent light. Their brains have constructed a scene in full sensory detail, but it's a scene that never happened. This reveals something crucial about memory. It isn't a recording. It's a story the brain tells, one rooted in emotion and shaped by culture. And like any story, it can be revised. When those revisions are shared, when an entire generation misremembers the same moment, it stops feeling like error. It feels like history. The Hello, Clarice effect teaches us that even the most personal memories are vulnerable to collective influence. That what we think we saw may be what we were told to remember. And it leaves us with a haunting realization. Our favorite scenes might not be scenes at all. They might be echoes, reverberations of what we wanted to hear, whispered again and again until they drown out the truth. In the quiet of memory, sometimes fiction speaks louder than fact. He strides across the stage, mustache gleaming, top hat tilted, spotlight glowing. We are the champions of the world. But we've been here before. Let's shift the lens again, this time to another relic of memory, the beloved children's book series featuring a family of bears, or a world map that's not quite where we remember, or a protester who never died, but whom we still mourn. Now consider the fruit of the Loom logo that never had a cornucopia. The Monopoly man who never wore a monocle. The quote from The Silence of the Lambs that was never uttered. These are not isolated curiosities. They're symptoms of something more profound, a pattern. And that pattern continues, now, with a story about fruit, wealth, and cultural expectations. The case of the fruit of the Loom cornucopia already bent our assumptions. But perhaps no false memory is as widespread and as oddly comforting as the tank man misremembering. Yet there's another artifact of collective memory that stands out. The Berenstain Bears, or rather, the Berenstain Bears. Ask anyone born between 1970 and 1995. They'll tell you about the books, the spelling. The voice in their head that knows it was an E, but it never was. Official records, from first publication to present day, confirm it has always been spelled with an A. The resistance to this truth isn't casual. It's fierce. Parents have argued with their children. Adults have rifled through childhood belongings, searching for evidence of a forgotten truth. Some even claim to have seen Berenstain printed, only to later find it had changed. How can memory be so wrong and still feel so right? Neurologists and psychologists suggest a confluence of factors. phonetic expectations, early childhood imprinting, cultural reinforcements. Once a belief is formed, especially one tied to childhood, it becomes a fixture in our mental architecture. Correcting it isn't just about changing a letter, it's about rewiring a piece of identity. And then there's the emotional layer. False memories like these feel real because they carry emotional context. When we think about the Berenstain Bears, we don't just see the title, we feel the warmth of bedtime, the voice of a parent, the texture of a quilt. Those feelings validate the memory. They anchor it. So when the evidence contradicts us, we don't just question the fact, we question the self. Each Mandela Effect moment, whether involving a film line, a map, or a cereal box, peels back the illusion that memory is reliable. These aren't trivial mistakes. They're glimpses into how the mind constructs reality, not just records it. When enough people share the same false belief, it becomes folklore. A parallel version of history passed from person to person, generation to generation. And eventually, the myth feels more real than the memory it replaced. So we're left asking, if the world we recall doesn't match the world that is, where exactly do we live? In a documented present or in a remembered past? Somewhere in between lies a shimmering border where fact and feeling merge. And every now and then, something crosses it. Not to deceive, but to remind us, memory is not a mirror. It's a mosaic, one that changes each time we look. A logo, a continent, a children's book, a moment in history. Each of these holds a place in our minds, a snapshot, a soundbite, a symbol we carry without question. But what happens when the snapshots blur, when the film reel of memory skips a frame and inserts something that was never there? Among the most mysterious of these phenomena is the case of Tank Man, a defiant figure standing before a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square in 1989. For many, it is the very image of resistance, of one person holding back the machinery of power. But countless people remember it differently. They remember the tanks rolling forward, the man crushed beneath their treads, the image cutting to black. Except that footage doesn't exist. In every recorded version, the tanks stop. The man survives, at least in the scene. And yet, the memory of his death persists. It haunts people. Some swear they saw it, felt it. Their minds conjure screams, sirens, silence. A martyrdom etched not into film, but into belief. These stories force us to consider, is memory always rooted in experience? Or can it be shaped by expectations, by emotion, by the weight of the moment? Cultural trauma may hold part of the answer. In 1989, the Tiananmen Square protests ended in bloodshed. While Tank Man lived in that moment, hundreds of others did not. Our minds, unable to separate image from atmosphere, may have filled in the blanks, writing a more tragic and somehow more fitting ending to a story of defiance. It's not the only place where memory stretches reality. Think of the Queen song without its grand finale, the logo without its expected horn. The Disney Queen who never said "mirror, mirror." In each we find a similar pattern, a sense of emotional resolution replacing what actually occurred. Our brains don't just store facts, they seek meaning. They complete stories. Recent studies in cognitive neuroscience suggest that emotionally intense events are more likely to be altered in memory. The mind, in its desire for coherence, weaves fragments into narratives. And when many minds do this in similar ways, the result is a shared illusion, a cultural memory stronger than the truth it replaces. In a way, these false memories tell us what we wanted to believe, or what made sense in the emotional logic of the moment. Tank Man should have died because that's what tyrants do. The Monopoly Man should wear a monocle because he's rich and dignified. Mandela should have died in prison because that's how tragedies unfold. But none of it is true. Still, we carry these stories not just as mistakes, but as metaphors. They reflect our values, our fears, our need for closure. And in doing so, they become part of the larger human story. Not the history we can prove, but the one we feel. So maybe the real phenomenon isn't just that we misremember. Maybe it's that we remember through the lens of longing, for justice, for clarity, for endings that make emotional sense even when the facts don't. In these slivers of altered memory, we see the outline of something deeper, not deception, but desire, not failure, but faith, in our own stories. The mind doesn't just record, it imagines, and in that imagination, whole histories are born. What do we trust more, our memories or the records that contradict them? Across these 14 chapters, we've wandered through a strange territory, one where logos morph, lyrics vanish, quotes rewrite themselves, and history flickers like a dying bulb. Each step has revealed the same haunting truth. Memory, that most personal of possessions, is not a perfect archive. It is a story we revise, collectively, emotionally, endlessly. We began with Mandela's imagined funeral and found ourselves lost in childhood books, forgotten fruit baskets, and songs that never ended the way we swore they did. Along the way, we met researchers and psychologists, data and brain scans. And still the question remains unresolved. How can millions of people remember the same thing, vividly, emotionally, confidently, only to find out they were all wrong? The Mandela Effect is often framed as a curiosity, a glitch, a joke. But beneath the surface lies something far more profound. These aren't just mistakes. They're reflections of how human beings make sense of a chaotic world. When the facts are messy, when the story doesn't feel complete, we rewrite it. Not out of malice, but out of meaning-making. And we do it together. This shared editing of reality speaks to the heart of culture itself. Every civilization is built not just on what happened, but on what people remember happening. Myths, legends, national histories, all curated memories, polished over time. In that light, the Mandela Effect isn't an anomaly. It's a continuation of something ancient, a collective desire to tell the story that feels right, even if it's not entirely true. And here's the most astonishing part. These memories, though false, can leave real emotional imprints. They can shape identities, influence decisions, spark awe, grief, even trauma. A man crushed by tanks who never was. A president assassinated in a car that never held only 4. Falsehoods with real consequences. Truth then becomes more than fact. It becomes a dance between what happened and what we believe happened, between the evidence we can show and the narratives we hold close. So what do we do with this knowledge? Do we cast doubt on everything? Live in skepticism? Perhaps not. Perhaps the answer is something gentler. We accept that memory is not perfect, but it is honest in its intent. It reflects not just events, but emotion, not just data, but desire. And maybe that's what makes us human, not our ability to remember perfectly, but our ability to feel meaning in what we remember. To build stories not just from what is, but from what matters. In the end, the Mandela Effect isn't just about errors in memory. It's a mirror, showing us how we see the world and how we want the world to be. So next time you're certain of a quote, a detail, a moment, pause. Ask yourself, is it true because it happened, or because I needed it to happen? That space between certainty and curiosity, that's where understanding begins. Not in the precision of memory, but in the wonder of questioning it,